This program, while curated to help you improve your health, contains general advice and should not replace the individual advice of your medical practitioner.
Why is the microbiome important?
Is return the clock back 10 or 20 years.
The main form of life on Earth is microbial.
Going there, it definitely threw into perspective my disconnection from my food supply.
I believe, we have this gift of the microbiome.
That's where we should be looking.
And it's an amazing thing to me to think, what's our relationship with microbes? We are microbial, in essence.
In life, it's normal to have ups and downs. But what do we do when we get stuck? I've always been fascinated by the health journey. Why do some people get better while others fail to make the shift? In Season 1 of The Shift, we explore the fascinating field of gut health and help you discover what is really going on with your digestion, microbiome and health.
The gut is amazing.
Changes our concept of the human body. Become useless to the healthcare system.
We're always shifting. Your genes are shifting, your microbes are shifting, everything is shifting.
I'm Katherine Maslen, and this is The Shift. Our concept of the human body is changing. The area of the microbiome is the most exciting area of health we've discovered for quite some time. The human body is amazing. Not only do we have an intricate play between our tissues, cells and DNA, but we now know that our microbiome also communicates with our body, and our body communicates with our microbiome. It is estimated that we have 2 to 3 kilos of symbiotic bacteria, yeast and viruses that make up the human microbiome. When you break down the DNA of the human body, we are 99.5% bacteria and only about 0.5% human DNA. That's right, you are actually only made up of 0.5% human DNA. So who is really running the show? Are you bacteria or are you human? I couldn't have a microbiome conversation without calling on the expertise of Dr. Marvin Singh. Most of you by now would be quite familiar with Dr. Marvin, who's an integrative gastroenterologist from San Diego, California.
I think this is a very rapidly evolving field. It's one of the most exciting fields in science now, and makes me super excited to be an integrative gastroenterologist in this day and age. The microbiome has so many different functions that we don't even really realize. I recently wrote a book chapter in the new edition of Integrative Gastroenterology, which I'm one of the co-editors for, and it's about lifestyle medicine and the microbiome. And in that process, I reviewed hundreds of articles, and there was science to support that the microbiome plays a role obviously in diet and digestion, nutrition, but also in sleep, also is affected by stress, also affected by toxins, and plays a role in the detoxification process, and even plays a role in social interconnectedness and love. I mean, this stuff is fascinating. I mean, there's a particular kind of bacteria that exists that can actually increase blood levels of oxytocin. That is crazy to me. I mean, so, we're going to see, that the gut microbiome is really one of the most important parts of our human body.
Cale Brock is a journalist and filmmaker. I tracked him down because I knew that in the making of his latest film, The Gut Movie, he had gone off to Africa and lived with a remote tribe in a plight to investigate the microbiome.
So with The Gut Movie, we started off by identifying a culture who we thought would be a good example of a traditional hunter-gatherer diet and lifestyle. So that was the San people in Namibia, sometimes called the Bushmen. And we were able to make contact with them because I had a friend who ran an African tour company who I'd met in Africa when I originally went there. And I said, hey, do you think it would be possible to go out and live with these guys for a while? And he said, hey, let me try and make it happen. And he called me back like 2 weeks later. I wasn't expecting it. He called me back like 2 weeks later. He's like, hey, let's go. And I was like, oh, okay. So we spent all this money on this trip and we really had no idea what we were expecting. And we arrived and it was like 3 days of travel to go out in the bush with this tribe. And they're basically in a conservatory where they're allowed to or permitted to live their traditional lifestyle, which is very hard for those populations to do because of the encroachment of other cultures from the West. In Namibia particularly, it's German culture. So there was very little space for them to do that. So what happened was they were allocated this land in order to live their natural lifestyle, albeit in a restricted way, in that they can't hunt certain animals, their area is restricted. Typically, they were a nomadic tribe. So a few things that had changed. But we knew that a lot of them hadn't had access to Western medicine, so there was that antibiotic factor. Had they been exposed to antibiotics? And hopefully they hadn't, so that we could get, as much as you could nowadays, an untainted gut microbiome sample from them. And that was another premise that we wanted to work into the film, was the idea of actually collecting poo samples while we were there to actually have a look at the gut microbiomes of these cultures. And that turned into a pretty funny, entertaining part of the film when I actually had to collect all the various samples of poop. So that was pretty interesting. We rocked up and there's nothing there. It's just this little area of bush. It reminds me of where I sort of grew up in Port Augusta. And it was just sort of desert, and there's these tiny little men who walk through wearing their little loincloths, and they come up and they speak a little bit of English because they're having like a very small tourist operation there, and that people come and camp and they show them around and show them the lifestyle. And they came and they were the nicest, friendliest people ever, and they had us for a week, and I slept in a tent and they went off and did their own thing in the evening, and we sort of had some dancing around the fire at night, and we cooked all the foods that we went out and gathered during the day, and we went hunting. And that was quite an intense experience as well. And it was just a beautiful, idyllic, romantic story to tell. And then we used that story to also share some information about the gut microbiome.
This is such an interesting story, and it really highlights just how much our environment dictates our microbiome and health. We'll hear more about what Kale found later in the episode. Eugenia Bone is the author of 6 books, including Microbia, The Unseen World Around You. She has an amazing passion for microbes of all sorts, so I wanted to hear her view on the microbiome. I began by asking her what microbiology actually was.
So microbiology is the study of microbes, and microbes are organisms that are too small to see with the naked eye.
What is the story of our microbes?
With every breath, you are delivering oxygen to these little organelles in your cells called the mitochondria. And that little organelle, what it does is it uses the oxygen to convert sugar into energy to make you go. So mitochondria turn out to be the descendants of a little bacterium that respires oxygen, that used oxygen in the same way it's currently using oxygen in our cells today. What happened is that one cell, you have an ocean full of all these cells. This is 3.8 billion years ago, okay? So there's this ocean full of all these little cells floating around and eating each other and photosynthesizing and doing all these kind of different ways of getting food and surviving the day. And one cell type engulfed, but didn't consume, another cell type, which was this little ancient bacteria that currently has the same genes or similar genes to the bacterium that causes Rocky Mountain spotted fever. So this cell engulfed but didn't consume a little bacterium, and the two became symbiotic. The master cell, the host cell, kept that little bacterium and utilized it to produce energy for itself. That was like the beginning of complexity. That's what separates you and me from a bacterial cell. Our cells have mitochondria. We are the result of a marriage of microbes. And it's really cool when you think about it, because the little mitochondria in our cells, it's lost a lot of genes over time. You know, it's become fully dependent on our host cells. But if your cell breaks open and the mitochondria get loose in your bloodstream, your immune system will recognize the bacterial DNA and attack it. And it's an amazing thing to me to think, what's our relationship with microbes? We are microbial, in essence.
Rodney Diertert is a professor at Cornell University and the author of the amazing book, The Human Superorganism. I loved the way that he explained the microbiome.
The microbiome is the collection of bacteria, viruses, fungi, archaea that inhabit, in this case, the human body, if it's the human microbiome, but they inhabit all complex organisms. So again, they're in other animals, they're in plants. There is a soil microbiome, so there are media that are said to have a microbiome. So there is the stratosphere, the upper stratosphere has a microbiome. Water has a microbiome. Soil has a microbiome. So essentially, the main form of life on Earth is microbial. We are a microbial planet first and foremost, and we're privileged to be one of the ultimate distributors of microbes around the globe because we're very mobile and we can spread them around and we can protect them and us. And in doing so, I think we'll better protect Earth.
Why is the microbiome important?
It's important because it is really the principal gateway to the world. It is the filter or the lens through which we see what's outside of us. So all chemicals, drugs, and food are filtered by the microbiome, and we only sense what's there with them having dealt with it first. So who knows what's really there? But it means that because we've ignored that or didn't know to look there, that we've ignored what may be the most important part of our metabolism, our physiology, and our capacity to, in a healthy way, engage what's outside our body.
The gut microbiome is composed of trillions of bacteria. Some say 100 trillion bacteria.
Here's Dr. Marvin Singh again.
They outnumber our human cells 10 to 1 and outnumber our human DNA 100 to 1. So I tell everyone that we all look like different people, and we are different people, but we're really just an amalgamation of a combination of different kinds of bacteria, viruses, and fungi.
Do you have a question you'd like to see answered? Go to theshiftclinic.com/group, jump in the community and ask us.
The Shift!
As I mentioned earlier in the series, Dr. Leo Gallant is a pioneer when it comes to looking at how microbes affect our health. He was studying the microbiome before the term microbiome was invented. We had such a great conversation about the microbiome, and in fact, there was too much information to fit into the shift. So do make sure that you subscribe so that when the expert series is released, you don't miss a thing. But for now, here is one of my favourite parts.
What I think is most important about the microbiome in applying it to medicine is it changes our concept of the human body. And the microbiome is not just a collection of bacteria that's like a 10th organ inside us. It is an internal bioreactor that modifies all aspects of our function. And thinking about it that way, we realize that our bodies are really ecological systems, just like the Earth is a series of ecological systems. And establishing health is about restoring normal ecology. Nutrition plays a role there. Exercise and behavior play important roles. And some of these roles are actually mediated by the microbiome. That is, your thoughts alter the microbiome, just as the microbiome impacts on the function of your brain. What you eat definitely impacts the microbiome, and gut bacteria often determine what you get out of your food. And many of the effects of nutrition on health are mediated by gut microbes, especially those related to phytonutrients like the bioflavonoids, which need to be liberated from food by gut microbes and can be destroyed by gut microbes. There was this fascinating study done at the Weizmann Institute a few years ago, that's in Israel, where they took mice and they subjected them to yo-yo dieting. The yo-yo dieting was that they would go on a Western diet, human Western diet, and then they would go back on laboratory chow. And on the human Western diet, they would get fat. And when they put them back on laboratory chow, they would lose the weight. But each time they cycled, they got fatter and didn't lose as much weight. Now, they looked at what all of this was doing to the microbiome, and they found that each time they went on the Western diet, their microbiome lost diversity, and each time they went back on laboratory chow, it increased diversity. But with each cycle, the loss in diversity was greater and the recovery was less. And so the mice were ratcheting up their level of obesity, which is exactly what happens with humans who are on yo-yo diets. They then tried to figure out, okay, well, what is all of this doing metabolically to the animal? And their metabolic rate was slowing. And they discovered that the most important change that was happening was that the level of bioflavonoids in their blood and in their stools was going down. And with each cycle, the bioflavonoid level dipped further. And there were two particular bioflavonoids that were really depleted: naringenin, which is found most concentrated in grapefruit, and apigenin, which is most concentrated in parsley. But these are widely found in a number of vegetables. Now, that's kind of weird because the Western diet is pretty low in those. So each time they go on a Western diet, they'd destroy something that they're getting more of on the laboratory chow. When they fed the mice apigenin and naringenin, they reversed their obesity.
Some fascinating stuff there about microbes and obesity. Food is an obvious place to look, but I bet you haven't thought to look to your gut when you're trying to lose a few pounds. Rodney Diertert is at the forefront of microbiome research, so I asked him if there was anything recent that had been interesting when it comes to the microbiome.
Yeah, well, I think one of the earth-shaking things for scientific researchers was this finding. We've used these rats and mice, the lab models, that are developed as different genetic strains and then are housed in universities and in research institutes and the National Institute of Health, for example. And we've used them now for decades very effectively. But the idea from Aaron Erickson's work at the University of Missouri that they are more affected in terms of their microbiome and then their majority of genes by the housing that they're in than by their genetic breeding is stunning. So he has shown that you can take mice of different strains and compare them, and for the microbiome part, they're from completely different genetic strains, wildly different chromosomal genetics. But if they're from the same company and the same facility, they're going to have a microbiome that is, in some ways, at some levels, more alike than all the different strains of mice from a different company with a different geographical location, maybe New Jersey instead of Bar Harbor. Location matters more than breeding at some level for the microbiome, which again is the majority of your genes. So he's basically saying, change animal handlers, you might be affecting your experiment. Change the room your animals are in, you might be affecting your experiment, which human health analyses are being based on. So that's stunning to me. Now, I realize that that's sort of trivia for, a lot of people who don't do scientific research, but this is literally shaking the pillars of what a lot of health research is based on that starts with animal research. Because it means if you haven't been monitoring that, you don't know. It's just like the safety testing. You don't know. And I've talked to people who, they said, I got this great research result in my rats or in my mice. And then they couldn't repeat it. I said, did you by any chance change facilities? And they said, yeah, they built a wonderful new animal building and we moved into it in the 6 months in between me doing these experiments. I'm like, there you go.
This blew my mind a little, so I just want to clarify what Rodney said so you really get it. Moving rats into a different environment changed their microbiome. Once their microbiome was altered, they responded differently to treatment. Location matters more than breeding. We can translate this to humans by hypothesizing that our environment matters more than our genetics when it comes to disease. Imagine that. The other thing I was very curious about was if humans living together changed each other's microbiomes.
Yes, that's a really interesting question. The answer is probably yes. So we know, for example, that if you have a dog in the household, or dogs will help you share microbiomes. They are really good about going from one person to another and helping spread them, and they do. So yes, there is a local effect, and I'll tell you what supports that. First of all, you can do analysis and you can show that there can be some moving closer together on microbiomes of people in the same household. If you have lab animals, so we do a lot of our safety testing and our efficacy drug testing starts with rodents or other animals, and I can tell you that in an animal facility that's maintaining rodent colonies, they have a limited exposure to pathogens deliberately. So they don't exactly have what's in the wild. So what happens to those in these lab animal colonies? They start to have microbes derived from the lab animal handlers, humanized microbes. So yes, we share, and we share with animals, and we share with each other. If we're living in close proximity, we share. You go into a hospital, you might pick up C. diff. You go into a hotel, you'll probably pick up some microbes from the prior occupant. You're living 24/7 with somebody else in your household, you'll share microbes. Yes. And I can tell you here's an interesting question, and that is, are non-communicable diseases truly non-communicable?
Whoa.
Maybe we ought to go back to just calling them chronic diseases, because here's a question. If there is a obesity spectrum of microbes, and we know that there are diabetes or an inflammatory bowel, and you're sharing microbes in your household, are there circumstances where you could then see shifts of other household members into that spectrum where you started to actually have clinical signs? I mean, could you actually share enough differences that you had an NCD onset? And I can tell you, I get emails and calls repeatedly with that very question, like, I've had inflammatory bowel for years, and now my husband has it. And we're really wondering, did we share that? We know it's non-communicable, but is it really? So that's a good question. Can you get a shared dysbiotic microbiome that, with diet similarities, even though spouses are genetically different in the chromosomal genes, even with that, can you hit a spectrum where it tips over into a similar NCD?
This reminded me about what Dr. Felice Gersh said earlier in the series when she was talking about microbial transmission through our partners in the case of intercourse and oral sex. How much does this alter our microbiomes? Should we be concerned about the health of our partners' microbiomes and how it affects our health? What Dr. Leo Galland has to say next about the changes in the microbiome on the behaviour of mice is also very interesting.
I think the best article I've ever written is it was published in 2013. It's called The Gut Microbiome in the Brain. And I spent a lot of time putting this together, and it was mostly human data, looking at the impact of microbes on brain health. But I started out with a couple of animal studies that are pretty fascinating. So if you take germ-free mice, that is, mice that have no bacteria, that have been raised sterilely, their behavior is different from ordinary mice. And the main difference is if you put them in what's called an open field activity box, they're less timid than normal mice. Humans have lived with mice for millennia, so we have an expression, timid as a mouse. And normal mice in that box, they kind of stick to the walls. They don't explore very much. The germ-free mice, they're all over the place exploring. And so some of the researchers who have written about this have said, well, they're clearly not as stressed as conventional mice. Now, that doesn't make any sense to me. And in fact, they're wrong, because if you look at their stress responses biochemically, they're much greater than ordinary mice. So then there was a study that was done in germ-free rats, and the behavioral effect is the opposite. Ordinary rats, they're pretty aggressive in this box. And, we think of rats as being, pretty aggressive. Germ-free rats are pretty timid in the box. They don't go circling around the box. They kind of stick to the walls. They act more like mice. But their stress responses, when you study them by these other means, are just as accelerated or exaggerated as the stress responses in the germ-free mice. So what that says to me is that the kind of behavior that is normal for a mouse and the kind of behavior that is normal for a rat depends upon the microbiome for its expression. And not having that microbiome to help direct that behavior in a normal way actually increases the stress that that animal experiences. From the perspective of evolution, that is really important. For an animal to survive in the wild, it has to be able to balance properly its search for food with its avoidance of predators.
How do you think, when this is playing out in humans and the massive changes we're having in our microbiomes, how do you feel that changes the way that we exist day to day?
Well, there definitely impacts on our stress responses and on various neurologic functions. And you can't have a germ-free human. So the way that is being studied is either with antibiotics or probiotics. And it's complicated. So there are a species of bacteria called Akkermansia mucinifera, gotten a lot of attention because it's associated with protection against diabetes and the ability to lose weight and stay lean. But it turns out that being colonized with Akkermansia mucinifera in your gut triggers responses in the brain that involve gamma aminobutyrate, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. Drugs like Valium, for example, they act through GABA receptors. Well, the triggering of GABA receptors in the brain by Akkermansia in the gut, that may be a good thing or it may be a bad thing. In a study of people who suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder and who were compared to people who had undergone similar levels of trauma but had not suffered post-traumatic stress disorder, there was a deficiency of Akkermansia as well as bifidobacteria in the gut microbiome of the PTSD sufferers, which may be due to the lack of GABA stimulation. On the other hand, in people with Parkinson's disease and also in autistic children, there are areas in the brain that have excessive GABA activity. And those are two conditions that are associated with high levels of Akkermansia in the gut. So maybe you want it, maybe you don't. And the key to helping people achieve balance is understanding what this individual needs.
One of the very important questions that was raised as I interviewed the experts for The Shift was, what is more important, our human genetics or our gut microbiome when we're looking at disease?
Well, recognize that the microbiome influences the expression of the human genome. And at the same time, our human genome influences the functionality and diversity of our gut bacteria. That our human genome is changed moment to moment in its expression by our lifestyle choices. The code itself is indelible, but the keys on the piano remain static in terms of the number of keys. But how the song is played, how those keys express themselves, is something very much under your control. That's a new way of thinking about this idea of epigenetics, that we influence the expression of our genetic code, that our gut bacteria also influence the expression of our genetic code. And therein lies our ability to override these predispositions for things like Alzheimer's or heart disease.
Let's check back in on Kale Brock and his journey into the heart of Africa to live with the Sun people. I was very curious about what it was like and what type of stuff it brought up for Kale on his visit.
Going there, it definitely threw into perspective my disconnection from my food supply. That was probably one of the biggest things I took away from the experience. The fact that most of us don't have any idea where our food comes from, and we're so disconnected from nature now that we almost worship it as if it's not a part of us, but it is. We are a part of nature and nature's a part of us. But we live such a disconnected lifestyle that we don't see that on a day-to-day basis. So I realised that very early on, that when we were digging around and walking throughout the bush and we're thirsty, right? So it's like, oh, well, the guys know something for that. So we walked around and they noticed this little shrub on the ground that looks like every single other shrub around the place. And they just say, oh, no, there's a water root under there. And they dig up this 4-kilo water root that's just like a cucumber. It's full of water and everyone's drinking from it, sharing. So I saw immediately this naturalistic way of life that I was pretty much unaware of. I mean, I had been the camping kid. I had gone out west all the time when I was young going surfing, and that was still at another level to me. And they're lean, they're shredded, they can go all day without drinking water. It's this abundant fitness that you just do not see here. So I thought there's something in that. So going out there, the camping side of it, the terrain, all that, I was somewhat used to. But the embedding of their lifestyle into that environment was something that it was very foreign to me. So to be able to learn from them and adapt and try and adopt that way of life for a short time, it was quite a privilege, I thought.
Oh, absolutely. And a remarkable story as well.
Yeah.
We'll circle back to Kale shortly because I want to see what he learnt about the microbiome as a result of his travels. But first, I want to explore the concept that our environment affects our microbiome. Here, gastroenterologist Dr. Marvin Singh talks about the role of our environment in our microbiome health, but also the microbiome's role in detoxifying chemicals from our environment.
We're living in a toxic environment, and I think it's unavoidable because we're human beings on Earth, and no matter what you do outside of living in a vacuum that's sterile, there's going to be toxins exposed to your body. The gut microbiome actually plays a good role in detoxification. Just because you may have a low level of arsenic in this cup of water that I'm drinking doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to die or I'm going to get arsenic toxicity. These microbes in our gut actually can detoxify that arsenic. And what's important, I think, just kind of philosophically about the microbiome is that, we always say we want a diverse and resilient microbiome. So that really means we want a lot of different kinds of bacteria that can do a lot of different kinds of things. It's just like, if you're going to start a company and you want to hire 100 employees, you don't want 100 robots that can only do the same thing. You want 100 different people with a wide variety of skills and a wide variety of backgrounds, because whatever problem occurs in your company, you are hopeful that you'll have a better chance at solving it or making a better outcome out of it. And that's kind of how the gut microbiome works. So why somebody has a problem with arsenic in the water and somebody doesn't have a problem with arsenic in the water may have to do with a variety of things. It's not just so simple as the gut microbiome. There are genetic factors and other things, that are probably also involved. But part of this is really the diversity or resiliency of the gut microbiome and what is there. This one study that I'm talking about with arsenic in the water demonstrated that if certain probiotics were given to people who were deficient in their microbiome composition, they had an improvement in detoxification of the arsenic.
From working with thousands of patients, I know that learning doesn't always equate to doing. For some of you, I know that you'll listen and take action right away, but for others, you're going to need a little more help. That's why I've developed my Gut Shift program. Over 12 weeks, I'll take you through what you need to make a shift in your gut health step by step. It's based on the latest clinical research combined with the clinical experience from seeing thousands of patients. Registrations are now open. Go to theshiftclinic.com and click on Shift with Us.
The Shift!
What about the air that we breathe? Does that impact on our gut health? I introduced the concept of particulate matter in episode 5. Particulate matter is what you call all of the microscopic particles in the air that we breathe. With the increase in air pollution caused by motor vehicles, aviation, fossil fuels like coal, and also the increasing amount of severe fires we are seeing, we have an increased amount of harmful particulate matter in the air that we breathe. I wanted to see what Rodney Dietert's thoughts on particulate matter and the microbiome were.
Well, it definitely plays a role. So your airway microbiome changes as these are inhaled. Your immune system is affected, and the combo. We know different particles reach different levels in the respiratory system. Some penetrate deeply, others stay more in the nose. And we know that from a risk level, the distance you live away from a major traffic artery is directly related to risk of childhood asthma. One of the things that is intriguing, and early on I was asked, well, is this just a fad? And my answer to that was only if you think breast milk is a fad, because there are these things called complex oligosaccharides in breast milk that we can't digest. It's there for the microbes and only for the microbes. So breast milk was actually created as much for the microbes as for us. But if you think about where the microbes are, they're everywhere we're exposed to the environment, in the airways, on the skin, in the gut, in the mouth, so mouth and nose, your genital tract. And then you think about where do chemicals like arsenic, particulate matter, where are we exposed to toxicants, environmental chemicals? Well, there's inhalation, that would be through the nose. There's oral, through the mouth. Skin, dermal exposures, right? Same place. Then we talk about pathogens. How do pathogens invade us? Influenza, inhalation, salmonella, oral. Routes of exposure to the toxicologists are portals of entry for pathogens, are locations of the microbiome. They're all the same. That's where we should be looking.
Oh, I love this conversation. It's fantastic. Can you tell me about the current state of the human microbiome?
Well, we know that in the U.S., for example, we're about 35 to 40% degraded in our microbiome compared to Amazonian indigenous peoples. And as a result, we have the increase in NCDs, whether it's asthma or diabetes or obesity or cardiovascular disease or cancer, you go down the line, they've all gone up in prevalence since about the 60s. The indigenous people in the Amazon area can become like us within a couple generations of moving first to the suburbs of Sao Paulo, for example, and then into Sao Paulo and adopting the diet there in the urban area. So it becomes all the more important when you realize that as a population, we're not what we used to be, and that is impinging our capacity to lead a healthy life and even to socialize. You only need to think about what planning needed to go into a child's birthday party then in the 50s versus now. Food accommodations. Our food has changed too, but we've changed. So we need to reverse this, and we can. We have the tools to start to do that, but only if the health providers are also in sync and people are also aware of this and talking to health providers about it.
One thing that Rodney said really struck home. We need to change this, and we can. The more we know, the more tools we will have to be able to turn this around and therefore curb the increase in chronic diseases for future generations. By now, you'd be getting to know UK nutritionist Jenny Tichy. Here's what she had to say about the microbiome.
I believe, we have this gift of the microbiome. Now, there's certain things that we couldn't have done to change it. Our parents made decisions about whether we were breastfed or whether we weren't. Decisions were made prior to that about whether we were C-section or whether we weren't. But to me, gut health has got to be a good balance of bacteria. The way we achieve that is a very individual pursuit, and I think it really depends on your starting point. But it's got to be where your microbiome is balanced, so you don't have dysbiosis, you don't have an imbalance of yeast, you don't have any parasites growing in there, you don't have any potentially pathogenic bacteria growing in there. But how do you know that? People can have some of those things and still seem on the outside to be perfectly well. People can have the same profile as someone like that and just be very, very ill. And I think you have to go back to the intuition and go back to how you're feeling. And if you are starting to feel unwell, I would say you've got to look at what's going on in the inside and try and get back to, balance of bacteria, your army, I call them when I'm talking to my children, your army of defense. You don't want to be the person that's getting ill all the time. You don't want to be the person that's lethargic all the time. You want to be, out there and living life to the full.
So what do we know about our microbiome? It can be very difficult to understand, but we're learning more and more each day. What I love most about the microbiome is the way that it demonstrates this amazing synergy that we all have as human beings. The synergy of our microbes and cells working together, and also the way that our microbiome reacts with the environment. This is something that's really important to me as a naturopath, is looking at the importance of the whole and all of its parts. Research is really beginning to show that our interconnectedness to our microbes and to our environment is so important. We can't continue to operate a medical system which compartmentalises the body. Author Eugenia Bone, who we met earlier, had a wonderful way of explaining how we need to look at the health of the entire microbiome and its parts.
There's so much information, it really can be mind-boggling. It certainly was for me. So one of the things that made it easier for me to understand my microbial symbionts was I started to truly understand the nature of my microbial symbionts that live in my gut and on my skin for that matter, when I started to think of them in ecological terms. What happened is, in the 1920s or something, the wolves of Yellowstone were tormenting the sheep of the nearby ranchers. And so the ranchers demanded the wolves be removed from the ecosystem. The Parks Department did so. They removed the wolves. But once the wolves were removed from Yellowstone Park, the elk populations increased. And then they started hanging around on the banks of the streams where they overgrazed all the willows. When they overgrazed all the willows, there was no material for beavers to build their dams. Without material for beavers to build their dams, there was no slowing of the stream. Without a slowing of the stream, the ducks didn't come and nest, and so on. There was cascading ecological effects. And then in the 90s, the environmentalists came forward and said, let's put the wolves back in the ecosystem, see what happens. It was like a miracle. The wolves re-entered the ecosystem. The deer had to stay on the hoof. Their population numbers diminished. The willows came back, the beavers came back, the ducks came back, and so on. So the sort of moral of the story, what was the aha moment for me, was when I realized the deer aren't bad for the park. They're only bad in the wrong population numbers. So the same thing is actually true of the bacteria in my gut. There's no good bacteria or bad bacteria. There's only bacteria in the wrong population numbers for the ecosystem that is you. And likewise, bacteria in the wrong place can also be an unhealthful situation, sort of like having a T-Rex in Manhattan. Right? That's going to cause a lot of trouble. But in the right environment, in its evolutionary environment, and in its evolutionary population numbers, because the community is composed of a lot of populations, and those populations are in ratios that have achieved ecological balance. And when you apply that to your body, ecological balance equals human health.
When it comes to your microbes, what happens when you increase or decrease a specific bacteria? There has been so much discovered, but yet there's still so much to learn. Let's see what cardiologist Dr. William Davis has to say about the topic.
We are the Model T of the microbiome. That is, we're just still making black cars with 4 cylinders and ugly as heck. In other words, we're not at the Tesla stage in the microbiome. There's so much to learn here. So, for instance, we make this yogurt that it's not about yogurt, it's about cultivating a species of bacteria called Lactobacillus reuteri and very specific strains. There's something called strain specificity, of course, in the microbiome. We have to be mindful of the strain of bacteria. So, for instance, you and I, all your listeners have E. coli in our guts. But what if you're exposed to lettuce contaminated by cow manure that has a very dangerous form of E. coli? You can die. You can die of incessant diarrhea and kidney failure from the same species, E. coli. So even though we have E. coli, exposure to the wrong strain of E. coli can be fatal. So if we cultivate Lactobacillus reuteri, R-E-U-T-E-R-I, based on the discoverer Gerhard Reuter in Germany, astounding things happen. Women lose their skin wrinkles starting within 4 weeks because there's an explosion in dermal collagen. There's deepening of sleep. You have childlike sleep filled with vivid dreams. You have dramatic acceleration of healing. Healing time is cut by 50%. So if you have a wound or a surgical incision or whatever, and you're going to heal in 14 days, now it heals in 7 days. And the healing process of the scar is much stronger and durable because it's filled with collagen. It's much less prone to infection. Hormonal health improves. Men get higher testosterone. Muscle increases. I gained 12 to 13 pounds of muscle in 3 weeks. I go to the gym once a week, maybe for 15 minutes. It's not like I'm hanging out at the gym all the time, but you have restoration of youthful muscle. We lose about 35% of muscle density as we age. You regain that. Bone density improves. Libido improves. In other words, what we're doing with this, cultivating these 2 strains of bacteria, is we're turning the clock back 10 or 20 years. So it's the first time I've ever come across something that really has a age-reversing effect. So that's just 2 species of bacteria. There's going to be, I think, sometime soon, a probiotic with the Akkermansia species. And Akkermansia is proven to be kind of a cornerstone species that is responsible for restoring metabolic health. So that if you can restore Akkermansia or increase Akkermansia populations in your bowel, you have protection from diabetes, inflammation, autoimmune diseases, seizures. Recent evidence shows that Akkermansia species can prevent seizures. Kids go on these ketogenic diets to prevent seizures, but the effect seems to be mediated by an increase in Akkermansia. So we're just getting a taste of what is possible in the microbiome. I predict that within just a few years, we'll be saying things like, do this in the microbiome and your Parkinsonism will go away, that your Lou Gehrig's disease may regress, that your dementia will stop or get better just via the microbiome. So we have a way to reverse autoimmune diseases potentially, neurological conditions, restore youthfulness, and it makes you healthy, and it costs almost nothing.
Reviews help us know that we're hitting the mark with what you need and help us to shape future seasons. I'd really appreciate it if you could take a few moments to leave us a review. I would love to know what you think.
The Shift!
So what about probiotic supplements? The probiotic market is huge, and they're one of the most common things that people self-prescribe without a lot of knowledge about what they're actually taking. I knew that Rodney Diertert would have something to say about the use of probiotics.
I get asked the question all the time, what probiotics? Because you can buy any number of them and you can get benefit, and you can waste a lot of money on things that aren't going to benefit you. It is a bit the wild, wild west still, but one of the things you should recognize is in the end, we're talking about installing bacteria with genes, and what you want is that metabolic punch. You want to change your metabolism and signaling in such a way it benefits your health. And to do that, you will need combinations of certain genes in place in the, for example, gut niches that you have. So people will have done research on an isolate that's called a strain, and the strain is a designation of the collection of genes. So that actually is very meaningful. So in other words, if you have one that you may see is Lactobacillus acidophilus, it's often in yogurt. Great stuff. But one isolate of that is not the same as another isolate of that unless you're dealing with a defined research strain. And so that's something to pay attention to in probiotics. And of course, whether or not you need it or not depends on maybe your microbiome analysis.
Rodney mentioned microbiome analysis. This is something that's relatively new, but we're beginning to have the technology available to look into the health of our microbiome. What we don't have too much of yet is a clear path of exactly what to do with this information, but it can certainly be helpful to see what your bacterial numbers and diversity are doing. We have so many interesting insights already about the microbiome, but we're only halfway there. In part 2 of this episode, I'm going to explore antibiotic use and other issues that have damaged our microbiome. You're also going to find out what happened to Cale Brock's microbiome after living with the Sun people in Africa.
Coming up on The Shift.
And that just keeps happening generation after generation.
But it was a good indication as to how quick the microbiome can change. We're talking within, 48 hours.
We've never had levels like we have now.
And he said, that's curious.
Do you think that people are starting to wake up to the fact that antibiotics are bad?
I do. I see evidence of that all the time. I see people making better decisions.
By now, you might be beginning to wonder what the health of your gut is like. To find out more, take our free online assessment at theshiftclinic.com/quiz. It only takes 5 minutes and you'll get a great report with some suggestions to get you started.
The Shift!
This series is produced by Must Amplify. Hosted by Katherine Maslen. Executive producer Ronsley Vaz. Music and sound design by Shade Furlong. Thank you to all of our experts. For more details on them, go to theshiftclinic.com/gut.
Still listening? You've heard a lot of client stories throughout this series, and you might be wondering if we could perhaps help you. Supporting people to shift is what we do best. Health is a journey, and we can help you to navigate this with one-on-one support with our clinical naturopaths, hypnotherapists, and counsellors. If working with us one-on-one interests you, go to theshiftclinic.com and click on Shift with Us.
The Shift!
Thank you for listening.
Every listen or download of this show
enhance this voice
directly funds the ending of sex
and human trafficking.
A voice for a voice.
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 Find out more at
amplifyimpacts.com.